Welcome to The Explainer. We're all out on the roads every day, but have you ever really stopped to think about what happens when things go horribly, horribly wrong? When there's a tragic accident, who is actually legally responsible? Well, today we're going to break down a huge Supreme Court case that answers that very question.
So who's on the hook? It seems like a simple question, right? But the legal answer can get really complicated. To truly get it, we need to dive into the heartbreaking story of a woman named Loretta Yu and the legal battle for justice that took over 2 decades to resolve.
And I'm not exaggerating when I say 2 decades. Just look at this timeline. The accident itself happened way back in December 1993. The lawsuit was filed pretty quickly in early 94. But the final word from the Supreme Court, that didn't come until February 2015. That is a 22-year wait. An entire generation grew up in the time it took for this case to find justice. So let's rewind. Let's go back to where this all started. The date was December 12, 1993. It's a busy morning on EDSA, one of the main arteries of Metro Manila. And for Loretta Yu, it was just another day, another commute. She had just gotten off a passenger bus. And what happened in the next few seconds was just catastrophic. She was hit and then run over by another bus. This one was driven by a man named Antonio G. Mena, who was an employee of a company called R Transport Corporation. Loretta was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead on arrival. So in the aftermath, what did the company R Transport have to say? They claimed their driver was just traveling at a normal speed and that he wasn't at fault. But the physical evidence from the scene told a completely different and much more violent story. You see, when the court looked at the facts, the autopsy report was brutally clear. The impact was so unbelievably forceful that, and I'm quoting directly from the official report here, her brain even spewed out from her skull and spilled over the road. The court looked at that and came to a very stark conclusion. There is no way an impact that violent could have come from a bus moving at a so-called normal speed. So the court's decision on this was simple and direct. The driver, Jimena, was negligent, period. He was driving in a busy area where people are constantly getting on and off buses. He absolutely failed to use the caution any reasonable driver would. He didn't slow down, and that failure led directly to this tragedy.
All right, so the driver was negligent. That brings us to the next big question, the search for accountability. Loretta's husband, Luisito Yu, was determined to get justice for his wife. So he filed a lawsuit. And he didn't just sue the driver. He also went after the driver's employer, R Transport Corporation. And this is where a really critical legal rule, Article 2180 of the Civil Code, comes into play. It's called employer's liability. And what it basically says is this. The law starts with the presumption, the assumption, that an employer is liable for the bad things their employees do while on the clock. This means the burden of proof was now squarely on R Transport. It was up to them to prove they were a diligent employer. To get out of being held responsible, they had to show the court solid, convincing proof that they exercised the diligence of a good father of a family when it came to hiring and supervising their driver.
And did they? Not even close. In fact, their failure was so total it was shocking. The Court of Appeals wrote in its decision, and this is a direct quote, "No evidence of whatever nature was ever presented." They had every chance, but R Transport provided nothing. Zero. No training logs, no background checks, no supervision records, absolutely nothing to show they were a careful employer. So that presumption of liability, it stuck. Okay, so their first offense completely fell apart. Their driver was negligent, and they couldn't prove they were a good boss. So what's left? Well, R Transport played its last card, something called the registered owner defense. This was a super technical legal argument, really a last-ditch effort to pass the buck. Their argument went like this. Number one, they said, the bus wasn't even registered in our name. It was registered to the Metro Manila Transport Corporation, or MMTC. Number two, they claimed they were just the ones operating the bus as part of some government program. And therefore, their conclusion was, hey, the registered owner, MMTC, should be the one to pay, not us. And right there, that's the central conflict that this entire case boiled down to. On one side, you have R Transport's claim. Only the name on the registration papers is liable, not the company actually running the bus day to day. But on the other side, you have this long-standing legal principle that exists specifically to protect the public, which says, nope,
Both the registered owner and the actual operator are on the hook. And so, after years and years of fighting in the lower courts, this whole question of who pays landed right in the lap of the Supreme Court. It was up to them to lay down the final word on this incredibly important issue of liability. Now, our transport tried to dig up some old cases to back up their argument, but the Supreme Court saw right through it. They pointed out a huge legal difference. You see, those old cases were about a breach of contract, like when a bus company fails to get a paying passenger safety to their destination. But this case, this was what's called a quasi-delict. It was an act of negligence against a random third party, a pedestrian, who had no contract with the bus company. And for that, the rules are very, very different. And this brings us right to the core of the Supreme Court's ruling. I'm going to read this because it's so important. The court said, "It is for the better protection of the public, for both the owner of record and the actual operator to be adjudged jointly and severally liable with the driver." The logic here is crystal clear. The law is meant to protect victims. It's not supposed to make them play a confusing shell game of who really owns what just to get justice. So the verdict couldn't have been more clear. Our Transport, the company that was actually operating the bus, could not escape responsibility. The Supreme Court shot down their petition. They confirmed that not only was the driver liable, but so was his employer, Our Transport, and the registered owner, MMTT. All of them were held solidarily liable, and that just means the victim's family could demand the full payment for damages from any single one of them. So, after a 22-year legal marathon, why does this ruling still matter so much? What are the big takeaways for all of us who use the roads today? Well, this case lays out a really clear chain of liability. First, drivers are responsible for their own negligence. Second, employers are automatically presumed to be liable for their employees. Third, the registered owner of a public vehicle is always liable to the public. And finally, and this is the crucial point from this case, the actual operator is also liable. It creates this broad safety net, making sure victims aren't left lost in a maze of corporate paperwork. So the law gives a really strong safety net to victims after the fact. But that also leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on. If the law makes everyone responsible after tragedy happens, who is truly responsible for making sure that tragedy never happens in the first place? That's something for all of us to think about.